Hi everybody, welcome back to my YouTube channel, The Spicy Web. My name is Jared White, and today we're going to talk about a very exciting topic, the rise and fall and rise again of HTML frameworks. What is an HTML framework? Man, there's this topic that's been going around lately that everyone's just buzzing about, this idea that we are now building HTML first frameworks. We're not building JavaScript frameworks anymore. We're building HTML frameworks. What does that even mean? Let's roll back the clock a bit, and I'm going to give you a whirlwind history lesson of building things out of HTML on the web, at least from my experience and what I've worked on. It's going to touch on a lot of the history of this and kind of where we've come to and where we're headed with all of this. I'm really going to date myself now, but I got started using this thing called server-side includes, or SHTML files, and it was literally just that, includes. Include this bit of HTML here for a footer. Include this virtual menu.cgi. So this was a way to essentially run a little program, a little script to spit out HTML. So this was my first introduction to dynamic web application stuff back in the 90s. Of course, that didn't last long. We quickly went over to this thing called PHP. I started using PHP in the 3 days, mainly the 4 days. And yeah, that was a big step forward for the web. PHP has this really simple syntax of you have these little delimiters, and within the delimiters you can stick all of your programmery bits, but outside of that it's just a text file with HTML. And that kind of created a blueprint that has stuck around in our industry for a long time. This idea that you're intermixing HTML and some programming language in some kind of template file. And yeah, it's almost a joke at this point. It's a meme, really, when someone comes out with a new framework that has some kind of intermix of HTML and a programming language like this. Somebody says, "Hey, congratulations, you've reinvented PHP." So yeah, but after working with PHP for quite a while, and even working on a little PHP JavaScript framework called XAjax in the middle 2000s, I won't get into that today, but essentially got into the world of Rails, and in 2008 really kind of transitioned from PHP to Rails. And the interesting thing about Rails are its views are using ERB, and ERB is essentially PHP but for Ruby. So you have these little delimiters where, in between the delimiters you're sticking Ruby code, but otherwise it's just pure HTML or whatever. And yeah, we're still living in the shadow of PHP. But we started needing to do more and more on the client side with JavaScript. And we first had these little libraries like Prototype and eventually jQuery. Have you heard of that little thing called jQuery? To let us more easily manipulate the DOM and handle events and all these sorts of things. And going into the early to mid 2010s, we start to see kind of this explosion of all these different JavaScript libraries and frameworks. The first one that kind of came on my radar was Backbone. Backbone was essentially like a way to escape out of the hell that was jQuery spaghetti code and start really defining some JavaScript objects and modules and kind of organize things more cleanly. But Backbone didn't really have its own templating language per se. I got really excited about a project called Knockout. Knockout was really the first instance I'd seen of this really smart way to create bindings between bits of HTML, different nodes, and these view models in JavaScript, and being able to handle events and reactively update stuff in real time. And I just really like Knockout syntax. I got so excited about it that I actually worked on this crazy project that was for Opal, which is a source-to-source compiler. You can write essentially Ruby code, and it gets converted to JavaScript, and you have a JavaScript runtime for Ruby. Anyway, yeah, crazy stuff. But I worked on this sort of port of Knockout to use Opal for writing these view models. And so you could just define all these models, load in some JSON, and then all of the bindings and events and things that were defined via Knockout would just work. That was a fun project, but kind of didn't go anywhere because I sort of ejected out of the Opal scene, unfortunately, and kind of went back to just working with JavaScript. In that vein, I did a lot in 2017 with Vue 2, and I liked Vue 2 because, again, it was kind of a similar idea to Knockout. You have all of your DOM nodes, you have your HTML structure already there coming to you from your backend, and you just, kind of sprinkle these bits into the HTML to turn it into a template. And then you can handle events and create your bindings of your data to your HTML and all that sort of thing. Interesting thing about Vue is even today, it still allows you to just mount Vue on top of HTML that you already have. You don't have to use like all front-end components like a lot of other JavaScript libraries. It's amazing that Vue has been able to keep that sort of progressive enhancement story all this time. But then we get to 2018, Stimulus comes out, a big deal for Rails Ruby fans, and we got to kind of start sprinkling stuff into our HTML that we already have. The modest JavaScript framework for the HTML you already have, yes. So this was kind of dialing back things a little bit on the front end because, by this time React had exploded, Angular.js had already come and gone, and there was a new Angular and all these different frameworks, right? But Stimulus was kind of trying to hold the line here of like, hey, let's generate HTML from the server the way we have been, but then we can kind of we can sprinkle in these little behaviors with JavaScript on top of that HTML. But even I finally succumbed to the siren call of Vue components, front-end components, whatever you want to call it. And I went to this meetup in 2019, and it was wild. Yes, January 15th, 2019. I have the receipt. Went to a meetup all about web components that just blew my mind. It was freaky stuff. I honestly didn't know what the heck was going on. Like, I was just like, whoa, what the heck? What is this stuff? Shadow DOM? Registering custom elements? What is this guy talking about? Yeah, just wild stuff. Took me a little time to wrap my head around, like, what is going on here? What are web components? Now I'm an unabashed fan, of course. But yeah, in 2019, learning about web components for the first time was mind-bending. Unfortunately, I didn't get to do too much with them at the time professionally because, this thing called Next.js got really big. And I was hired on to a project to work with React and Next and TypeScript and all that kind of stuff. So the new hotness, so-called, is something I've been working on actually consistently since that time. I'm still on this project, still doing work with Next and React. I'll say right off the bat here, I'm not a fan of JSX. I don't really like React a whole lot. I think there are better solutions out there for the majority of people, but that's another conversation for another time. I did get to use Lit. I'm very excited that I was able to introduce PetiteElement in 2020 to a client project that I'm still working on as well. And Lit is interesting. Lit, it used to be called PetiteElement, now it's just called Lit. Lit lets you create simple, fast web components. It's right here in the tagline. Very small, like 5K library that lets you basically write web components in a way that feels a lot like React and similar JavaScript libraries. But under the hood, you're just generating a true custom element web component that works anywhere, in any front-end framework, any back-end framework. Like, it just works everywhere as a component. Not saying you can server render your components anywhere, anytime. That's a whole different conversation. But if you're just talking about like front-end component frameworks, Lit lets you get really far, really fast, and I'm a big fan. But moving along to something a little different here, kind of going back to the future with this idea that, we really want to be able to start with a server rendered mindset. We really want to keep progressive enhancement in mind. And if we're writing components, if we're writing views, and we're trying to server render everything as much as possible, why do we have so much JavaScript everywhere all the time? Why can't we just go back to writing HTML, folks? So yeah, I feel like there's kind of a new wave of formats and syntaxes and languages that are starting to feel more like the HTML of old, and you can just kind of start peppering in some different things. So I want to give a shout out here to Vue. Vue's really been holding the line for some time here on this idea that you can create a component, a single file component, as it's called, that looks like everything's co-equal, right? You're not just writing JavaScript code and peppering in some HTML in your JavaScript, or what we might call HTML in JS. This is not HTML in JS. This is JS in HTML, kind of, sort of. Or maybe we just call it like everything's equal. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript all living next to each other, but not inside of one another, as the good Lord intended. So let's take a look at this single file component syntax real quick. We have a template, and inside of template, we have HTML. And at first glance, it just looks like pure HTML, but we can put in these little bindings, these little directives to, kind of say, okay, this DOM node, we want to render message here. Maybe we want to handle some events. We want to have conditionals and for loops and things like that. But we're going to kind of write that very simply inside of real HTML. And then separately, you have a script tag that has some scripty stuff in it. And then separately, you have a style tag, and that has some style-y stuff in it. And, these things are not commingled, but they're cohabitating within a single file component. And I think Vue is onto something here. And it's taken a while, maybe, for folks outside of the Vue community to start to realize the value of this. But I think the love is spreading, folks. I think Vue does a good job of kind of explaining, the different ways it can use Vue. As I said before, you can still just mount Vue on top of some HTML that came from a server, which is just wild. It can still do that. However, there's another project called petite-vue, and petite-vue is fascinating. This really, when I first saw petite-vue, this kind of launched a whole train of thought for me into all kinds of new directions, and I'll explain why in a moment. Petite-vue lets you use Vue syntax in a template sort of thing, but it's a very, very lightweight library. It doesn't use virtual DOM or anything like that. It just kind of mutates what you already have on your page in your HTML, and you just mount petite-vue, give it some JavaScript data and some event handlers and whatnot, and then it just kind of works. You can see here how incredibly simple that can be. So again, I'll touch on this in a moment, but when I saw petite-vue and a lot of work I've been doing with custom elements, I started thinking, I wonder if petite-vue and web components could join forces and create something special. Hold that thought. But we have some other frameworks that also have this idea of a single file component format where the HTML, the style, and the script are cohabitating within a file, but they're cleanly separated out. With Svelte, you can write these simple JavaScript blocks, and then you can write HTML that, again, looks like HTML, but has all these little bindings here for values and event handlers and so forth. And then you have a style block as well. And it all kind of nicely lives next to each other, but they're not intermeshed and intertwined with each other, which I really like. Not the biggest fan of Svelte, I will admit, and there's some reasons for that, both community-wise as well as technology-wise, but I do think, they're doing a good job here of continuing that single file component format where everything lives in its own little bucket there. I really like that. Another project that's actually been around for some time now, but I think hasn't ever really like captured the imagination of the industry as a whole, but maybe it should. It's some interesting stuff here. You can also create single file components here with a block of JavaScript and HTML, but like you don't even have the tags. Somehow you just kind of like, I'm just kind of writing JavaScript here, and then I just have some HTML and here's some styles. Like, it's very interesting how unbelievably simple they've made it. But yeah, you can have single file components. You can also split those bits of components out to separate files if you really want to. The thing I'm fascinated by is this idea of a split component. Marko essentially lets you create a component where all the HTML is server rendered only, and then the JavaScript just gets shipped out when it needs to. You might not even need any, but if you need to, it just ships out the JavaScript to handle the behaviors, but it doesn't ship out JavaScript to render all the stuff because you're rendering from the server. So it's a server rendered component with JavaScript behavior attached to it. And I find that fascinating. I think we need way more thinking around this approach for a lot of projects, and I'm glad Marko is trying to push this idea forward. And they're even doing this crazy thing I only heard about yesterday called this Marko 6 tags API that essentially lets you sort of program stuff with markup-ish. Like, this is wild. I'm not even sure what I think of this, but hey, I'm glad people are experimenting with this stuff. So I hope you're seeing, like, in all of these different frameworks we're looking at, like HTML feels like it's a first-class citizen again. It's a very different story than the sort of HTML in JS that we see with React, or even something like Lit, which, again, I really like Lit. I don't want to sound like I'm knocking Lit, but Lit definitely is like a JavaScript-centric mindset of how to develop all these components. And with these other frameworks, we kind of see a different take on things where HTML really is front and center. I think Astro did an amazing job recently when the Astro project launched of showing everyone what you can do when you kind of think HTML first. You can create these Astro components that are HTML peppered with some simple template-y bits. But all of these Astro components are like statically or even server rendered by default, and that's it. There's no JavaScript, 0 JS by default. But if you really, really need JS for certain things, you can kind of add that where needed. But otherwise, when you're writing your JavaScripts, like imports and setting up data and stuff, that's all just getting processed, at build time, essentially. Yeah, so that kind of gets us to the end of this section here, where we see kind of people going back to more SSR first or HTML first approaches to things. But we're not going to stop there, folks, because even more has happened in a very, very short amount of time, very recently, that is fascinating. And it kind of takes all these things to the next level with this idea that we can work with even just custom elements, but on the server. What? Yes, a new take on custom elements for progressive enhancement. Let's take a look at that. So there's a really interesting project from Zach over at the 11T team. He's been doing a lot of interesting work around web components lately, and there's this new project called WebC. And the documentation here is a little scattered, I have to say, but you can essentially create these little WebC files that you can reference from your HTML pages just by using the custom element name. So you can just have a page that's like my component and stick some text in there, and my component will get expanded out. This is a term you're hearing more and more now, expanding custom elements out by server rendering them. And you can write scoped styles and do different transformations, like say, I want part of my component to be markdown, and then it'll automatically translate that. Anyway, definitely check it out. There's a couple cool videos out now that do a better job than this README, I think, of explaining what WebC is and how it works. But I really think this is a step forward that's great for the web, and certainly for 11T fans. There's another project here called WCC, and that stands for Web Components Compiler. And again, it's this idea that you can write what seems to be a purely vanilla sort of web component, create a template element, stick some HTML in there, connect it up with the Shadow DOM. I'll explain that in a minute. Run it through a compiler, and then you get HTML out with Declarative Shadow DOM. I'll also explain that in a minute. But yeah, I've not taken too close of a look at this project, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on. Enhance, another new project, is a little bit of a hybrid. So you can write pages that are just HTML pages and stick some custom elements in there, and those will get expanded out, server rendered. But the actual elements themselves that you write as single file components, it is JavaScript centric, I would say. You're writing these JavaScript functions, and they have, little bits of HTML that get spit out here. Yeah, I think it's, it's a good hybrid approach, right? It's like, hey, let's write some pages. It's HTML. And then we're going to, sprinkle in components for headers and footers and different bits of data and whatever that we need to handle. And the way that we write those are with JavaScript, and they're just these little simple functions. I would not use that particular syntax. I would not choose to use that particular syntax because I feel like it's not continuing in the vein of what Vue and Svelte and others have done around having HTML, JavaScript, CSS live in their own co-equal buckets. But I really like what Enhance is doing, philosophically. I think it's a really great team that's working on this, and I'm really excited to see what they do in the future. Now, this next project isn't custom element specific, but I've experimented with using it within custom elements, and that's a project called Corset. Corset is very, very unusual compared to all these other libraries we're talking about, because your HTML is very, very simple HTML that is really just kind of setting up, what you would do normally with HTML. Like, you have tags, you have classes on tags or IDs or whatever, and it's just kind of like, here's some HTML. And then you write this sheet that looks kind of like CSS that sets up bindings and handles events and so forth. And yeah, the first time I saw this, it was another sort of mind-bending moment of like, what is happening? What is this? This seems strange. But I'm starting to dig it. And, again, Corset itself doesn't prescribe how you use it, but you could easily envision a world where, this HTML is in a template and this JavaScript is next to it. And then you have some styles next to that, and it's all in a single file component, and it's, a custom element that's using this under the hood for reactivity. I think you can see a path forward there. I've started to experiment a little bit with that, and that's pretty fascinating stuff. But so far, we've talked about things that people are just kind of inventing. Like, they're just kind of inventing these new approaches of working with custom elements, working with HTML, and and being able to have cohabitation of that HTML with JavaScript and so forth. But there's actually a proposal that's going to be hopefully a browser native technology eventually, but right now it's just a proposal called HTML modules. And I've been tweeting about HTML modules for a little while now, and it's pretty exciting stuff. So I've actually written an ESBuild plugin to let you use HTML modules today. So we don't have to wait for browsers to support it. You can just use HTML modules with ESBuild, hoping to start work on a Vite plugin next. Yeah, basically the idea is you can have a file. It could even be .html, and you write a script in a script type module block, and then you just have HTML, and you can just stick tags right in there, or if you want to be a little cleaner, you could wrap it all in a template tag. Either way is fine. And then when you import it, your JavaScript elsewhere can interrogate the template. Basically, the template becomes the default export of the module, and anything inside of your script tag can also get exported and used elsewhere in JavaScript. So yeah, it's some pretty interesting stuff. I also provide a lot of things that aren't part of the proposal that are experimental, but kind of lets you do a lot of interesting sorts of transformations around primarily your styles as you use this ES build plugin. Now, how does this relate to custom elements? Here's the explainer that kind of explains from the guy that worked on this proposal, how it all works. So yeah, I think he has a demo here. Yeah, so he has a demo here of how you would potentially write a single file component HTML module that is a custom element. So here you have a template, and within the template you have styles, and you also have just regular HTML that will be in your template. And then in your script, you get the template via this import.meta.document convention. So that's part of this proposal, is to just have that be a JavaScript API. And then in your constructor, you create your shadow DOM and you attach your template, and now you have a functioning template. So so this is pretty interesting stuff. It doesn't obviously address things like reactivity or event handling or any of those sort of things, because those are sort of like framework level concerns, you might say. But HTML module essentially lets you create a structure that is, like a vanilla way to create these modules where you're starting with HTML rather than starting with JavaScript, but they participate in the module system the way JavaScript modules do. Now, what's this whole thing about Shadow DOM? And what is Declarative Shadow DOM? We should get to that next, because Shadow DOM and Declarative Shadow DOM in particular is what makes this future possible. If HTML modules are the future, the Futurest Future is server rendering HTML modules by default. And for that, we need Declarative Shadow DOM. We want to be able to stream our components from the server, essentially. Declarative Shadow DOM is supported in Blink browsers like Chrome, Edge. Now, experimental support is being worked on right now for WebKit, aka Safari. I'm not sure when it's going to come to Firefox, but there are polyfill-ish ways to support it today. So a lot of people are already moving forward with Declarative Shadow DOM. But it's this idea that if we have custom elements, we can actually render out their shadow DOMs server side and stream that out to the browser. There's a really great article on web.dev all about how this works. Let me scroll back up here. So we can see here, like, we have a menu toggle custom element, and in the bad old days, all you would have is like open menu right here, right? Like your HTML coming from a server might be menu toggle, open menu, and that's the end of it. And anything that actually is inside of the Shadow DOM doesn't exist until the JavaScript runs and constructs its Shadow DOM client side. Not necessarily great, right? We want to be able to stream all this stuff from the server and be good progressive enhancement citizens. So this article explains how you can use this template with a shadow root attribute to provide your declarative shadow DOM. So let's wrap things up with what I'm working on right now, because we've seen the development of all these different things. We've seen the rise of single file components. We've seen the rise of HTML first single file components. We've seen the rise of custom elements being able to be server rendered. And what I'm thinking about is, how can we create server rendered custom elements with HTML templates that can be reactified? Is that a word? That can be reactified client side if necessary, but could also be purely server rendered. And strangely enough, the thing I am now working on is a way to use petite-vue. Yes, second look at petite-vue here. I'm calling it PetiteElement. This is still a work in progress, but I'm hoping to do like a beta launch of this in earnest pretty soon. But the idea is that you can have an HTML module that in your scripts, you just, define your custom element, you define your props, you pull in the template that's, part of your HTML module, define event handlers, whatnot. And then you have your HTML template right here, very simple. And then you have styles, and these styles can, of course, be completely scoped because it's part of the Shadow DOM scoping of styles. Although I have worked on a way to use only light DOM custom elements and still have sort of a CSS scoping story there as well, but we won't get into all that right now. Right now, this particular example here, this is purely a client-side component. But if we take a look at what the HTML template is doing, if you kind of squint at it, you can see like there's not a whole lot to it. The only thing the server would need to render, like if the server is going to render this out somehow, it would need to be able to take v-text, look up the value of a variable called text, and stick it in here. And it could still provide the template like this, right? Like it could provide exactly this, but text would be something that comes from the server, but it could be overridden with something that happens on the client because we still have our text binding, right? And this count here is 0. The server could render this out as 20,000. We'd still have a binding to count, so we could override that. And what if our server wasn't even JavaScript? What if we were using any server, say Ruby? So that's what I'm working on. I'm working on a Ruby solution to server render petite-vue templates so you can get declarative shadow DOM components in your HTML and then hydrate those with PetiteElement. I hope you caught all that. So this is still super secret. I'm not even going to tell you what the name of it is yet, but yeah, you can see an example here. This isn't using petite-vue syntax. This is using just kind of like a bespoke syntax I was messing around with to illustrate how flexible this could be, right? You don't even need to have petite-vue on the client. You could come up with a different sort of syntax. But the idea is that you have an HTML module, but on the server side, it parses the module. It looks for directives or bindings, whatever you want to call it, that you can define. Like you can define what bindings you're looking for, and then it could do things. So like we could even set up a Ruby ERB binding and embed ERB code in our HTML module and have this get rendered out, right? Or we could just have simple things like, hey, like the name variable, stick the text in here to replace this. We have footer includes HTML, so instead of using text, we use HTML. We want our footer to go in there. So this whole HTML module here could get server rendered out. You wouldn't even necessarily need the HTML module be loaded in as JavaScript on the client. You could have like 0.js by default. But if you looked at this module, you could envision adding a script tag with some JavaScripty things, and that would be like the client side of this module. This brings us to my final point here, which is that, whether you look at things like this or other projects like WebC or Enhance or the Marko framework or a lot of these different things, right? This idea is that HTML has once again become this base plate, right? Like the base plate of web development, not JavaScript, folks. It's HTML. HTML is the base plate, right? This nice declarative markup syntax. And on top of HTML, you start to put in these extra layers. You start to add your CSS. You start to add your JavaScript. And you can do that in a really nice, clean way. You can encapsulate things. You can use components. But you're starting with your HTML. HTML is the starting place. JavaScript is not the starting place like it is with React. It's not some other thing. You embed things in HTML-like syntax rather than the other way around. So I think that's what people are talking about, right? That's what we're talking about when we use this term like HTML first or HTML framework or real HTML templates. It's this idea that you have essentially parsable HTML that has little templatey bits inside of it. And those templatey bits can get either server rendered out or hydrated on the client to create reactivity. But you're starting with HTML. You're not starting writing a bunch of code, in JavaScript and then, like intermixing bits of something that's kind of like HTML within your JavaScript code. Again, there's not necessarily anything wrong with HTML and JS. I really like lit as an example, but I think there's a lot to be said for HTML first as a default, perhaps. Like, what if we said HTML first is the default? And if you really need HTML in JS for certain projects, certain components, certain component libraries, whatever, that's great. But the default would be JS and HTML and CSS and HTML. That would be the default. That's what I'm proposing with this video, is that the industry start to rally around this idea that we're an HTML first development workflow. All right, thanks folks. I know that was long, but I think this is such an interesting topic and there's so much to say about it. I feel like I've rushed through everything, and yet this is a long video and there's still so much to talk about, right? So anyway, stay tuned for this project I'm working on that lets you server render HTML modules in Ruby. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that can come through that. And also check out the ESBuild plugin for bundling HTML modules. All right, thanks everybody, and until next time, bye-bye.